Well, today we'll continue our survey of the book of Job. I won't rehash too much of what we have already been through, except to say that a large part of it had to do with Job not realizing what his trial is, kind of making a case, as it were, for himself against what God was doing to him. He didn't see it. And of course, Job's three friends were not helping matters at all. They came there in the first 7 days. They were helpful in that they didn't say anything. And so they brought a certain amount of comfort at that point. But after that, they began making assumptions and falsely accusing Job of things that they didn't know. And Job was even testifying to the fact that, hey, I did not do those things. And God even called Job blameless and upright, a man of high moral and ethical character in terms of the way that Job handled himself in accordance with the law of God. And so these two seem to be at an impasse. They continue to go at each other. And as we pick up chapter 15 and some of these, in fact, the bulk of the chapters we'll go through today, we will end up going through them fairly quickly, just because it tends to be a repetition of what has been going on before and what's going to continue to go on, and there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of new angles or information that these three so-called friends are bringing up, or that even Job is bringing up per se. So we'll go through and we'll highlight it, and we won't belabor the point as we quickly make it to the chapters where we find out some of what the real issues are. So chapter 15 is Eliphaz comes at him again, only harder this time. Probably because of what Job had said, or some of the things that he was saying in these previous chapters that were directed at him. And if you go through the book of Job and you look at these things and you follow it very carefully, you'll see that there's a little tit for tat and quid pro quo where Job will answer specific things and he'll make maybe insinuations, and then the next guy kind of picks up on that and he addresses Job and says it isn't so, and it kind of continues going that way, and then the level of intensity just kind of keeps going up as well. But basically it's the same exact argument. He's calling Job wicked. So then in chapter 16, Job replies. In verse 2, he says, I've heard many such things. This is what, he's kind of responding to Eliphaz here. He says, miserable comforters are you all. Again, in other words, you're not comforters at all. The book of Job, among other things, is a lesson not only in how to handle your own trials, but in how to handle the trials of others. And we see basically by the way these guys acted, what not to do in this case. And of course, we also look at the assumptions, because in all this, everything that Job's saying about himself in terms of what he did or didn't do, he was correct and accurate. And these guys say, no, there's something here that you didn't do right, or that you should have done, or whatever. And they're basically saying, yes, you're a sinner, and because you have such this horrible trial to go through, it surely must have been a big sin. And they feel like, okay, you're just not telling us. And to a certain degree, I think that these guys are kind of trying to get, they feel that Job's getting his comeuppance, because Job was a righteous man. He was a man that was upright and blameless as God called him. He did things right according to the law of God. And again, I think people can be put off by things like that whenever they see somebody who is truly trying to be good and not trying to, offend others by it, or saying I'm better than you by it per se. That people are going, well, finally, Job's not so smart, or he's not so good after all. We got to kind of get this chance to throw it back at him, and surely there's something that he's just not telling us. Then we skip down to verses 9 through 11. And just something I want to just kind of bring to your attention, because it's kind of interesting. You see this in several places throughout the book of Job. These scriptures that seem to prefigure the coming Christ. All right. So it talks about, and it makes allusions to, or it very similarly parallels events that are going to happen, and at that point were going to happen in the future, and that Christ would do and fulfill. And so you see this part right here in verses 9 through 11. He says, he tears me in wrath and hates me. He gnashes at me with his teeth. My adversary sharpens his gaze on me. They gape at me with their mouth. They strike me reproachfully on the cheek. And it's like, okay, what's that talking about? It's like, well, do you remember what happened with Christ whenever they blindfolded him? And it's like, they said, well, prophesy who hit you now. And they would hit him like that. And they gathered together against me, and God has delivered me to the ungodly. Okay, and so again, this is something that happened to Christ. And it was all part of a plan, of course, and it was allowed by God. But nonetheless, it did, and they turned me over to the hands of the wicked. And then you look at verse 21. This looks to me kind of even an allusion to Christ coming as intercessor for us. In verse 21 it says, oh, that one might plead for a man with God, as a man pleads for his neighbor. And of course, Job's talking about this. And what we do see throughout the book of Job too is that there's the inspired word of God, that there are things that we're going to come across that there is no way for the physical man to know, especially at this time. All right? So we see that they have godly knowledge, that it has been given to them. And what we're looking at, because all Scripture is God-breathed, right? It is the inspiration of God. We look at these things as, okay, God has inspired them to be said and written for what? Again, the Scripture goes on. It says for doctrine, for reproof, for instruction in righteousness. So all these, even though we're skipping over the Scriptures, they're profitable for us to go through them and to analyze them and to look at them, especially in terms of trials and our view of God and how we go through them and how we help others handle them as well. But again, we'll see, and again, this might look a little tenuous to you in terms of like, well, I'm not really sure that that's, something that's pointing to Christ. But as we go along, it just seems like there's a few too many of these things for it to all be an accident that, okay, this is what Christ came to do, and this is what Job was looking for. And of course, nobody was doing this for Job at that point in time. Here he is sitting on this, I always kind of picture on the side of the road, as it were, in his sackcloth and ashes and, everything going around. And, here he was, and we'll see who Job was a little bit later, but nobody is like making a plea for him. Nobody is standing up for him, as it were, or interceding. And these three guys are doing just the opposite. So then chapter 17, verse 15. And again, I'll just try to hit some of the key verses. Like I said before, the book of Job can be somewhat poetic. I think it may have been a tendency back in those days to wax eloquent, as it were. But here we have verse 15. It says, where then is my hope? As for my hope, who can see it? And it's kind of more of a key verse, I say, of the chapter. I found that as you're reading through it, there can be like one key scripture, and then everything else is kind of like filling in, furthering the point, or backing that point up. But Job is saying is like, he doesn't have hope here. He's not finding it, and he doesn't believe he'll find it in the grave. So he continues to ask the questions to which he really doesn't have the answers. And as we go through these chapters, Job continues to ask many questions that he does not have the answer to, which is why he's asking them. Now, sometimes they're rhetorical, but nonetheless, he is really trying to scrutinize this trial to try to figure out what is going on. Then in chapter 18, we have Bildad, who speaks now for a second time. And he answers, as it were, the questions that Job is posing. But once again, he doesn't answer them in the right way. Verse 2, he goes, how long till you put an end to words? He says, Job, you just continue to talk and talk and talk and say the same thing, kind of like what we're doing. But he says, gain understanding. Just listen to what I'm trying to tell you. And the other guys as well. And afterwards, we will speak. Afterwards, now we can get down to the nitty gritty once you understand what we're trying to say, and then we can move forward. And then he answers also another thing that Job intimated previously. He goes, why are we counted as beasts? Because Job had said something like that in passing. And then he goes, and regarded as stupid in your sight. So again, I think a mature Christian, a mature individual should be able to say, okay, let's not do tit for tat. Let's not throw sticks and stones and these words around that are meant to hurt and offend and whatnot. And so I think what we're seeing here, what you can see, is a wrong attitude here in terms of the way Bildad is approaching it. He goes, what, you think we're stupid? He goes, he's basically saying, no, we're smart, which is, again, the wrong attitude to have. But nonetheless, he's everybody has ego, everybody has pride, and he's going on, and he's just, again, you see a certain amount of frustration and other, say, carnal attitudes that are coming out as these guys go back and forth. Then chapter 19 and verses 6 and 7. Know then that God has wronged me and has surrounded me with his net. If I cry out concerning wrong, I am not heard. If I cry aloud, there is no justice. And so, okay, what is then Job's attitude here? When Job says something like this, okay, what is he saying? He says, God, you have wronged me. He's saying that God did something wrong here, not Job in all of this. He surrounded me with his net. He says, if I cry out concerning this injustice, I am not heard. So he says, I'm telling you, God, that I am right and this shouldn't be happening to me. And again, it's that lightning bolt moment where when somebody says something like that, you step to the side, right? And he goes, if I cry aloud, there is no justice. So again, what kind of accusations is he making towards God? I mean, in terms of this whole scenario, he really believes, and again, this is what he's been telling the guys too, is that I have not done anything wrong. Nonetheless, we skip down to verse 25. And again, I just put that to reemphasize what's going on here. But then verse 25 and 26, we see a couple more of these statements that kind of prefigure, the prefigured Christ, their oppression, in other words, in terms of looking forward to what would happen. And even the translators, I'm not sure what it's like in any of the other versions, but in the New King James, it capitalizes Redeemer. He says, for I know that my Redeemer lives. So he knew, okay, Christ became our Redeemer. He was the one that bought us back. He's the one that paid the ransom for us. He paid that penalty when he became Jesus Christ and died on the cross and spilled his blood and paid for the sins, the penalty of the sin of all mankind. That's when Christ truly became our Redeemer of all mankind. And yet here we are in the book of Job, and Job has this insight. And one of the interesting things about the book of Job as a whole is the fact that I don't know what kind of view you have necessarily of the Old Testament or these people who lived in Old Testament times, and to how intelligent they were or how godly they were or how much information about God and the plan of God that they had. But here we have Job referring to him as the Redeemer. Again, this was still to happen many millennia later, and yet here he is, and he continues and says, and he shall stand at last on the earth. And again, so this goes hand in hand with those verses that we were talking about in chapter 16. And he says, and after my skin is destroyed, this I know, that in my flesh I shall see God. So he looked forward to that. And then verse 29, he ends up here with, be afraid of the sword for yourselves. So he's talking to his three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And he's saying, okay, you guys need to be concerned about the things that you are saying. Because he knew that they were wrong on many of the things that they accused him of. And he says, for wrath brings the punishment of the sword, that you may know there is a judgment. So again, he knew about the judgment. He also knew that if you acted wickedly, that these things would come upon you. And he's also telling these guys, you need to be careful because you are acting in the same vein. Right? You are then guilty or in danger of having the wrath of the sword, as it were. So then chapter 20, Zophar speaks for a second and final time. And he's not happy with the end of chapter 19. Okay? And so he describes the wickedness of Job in very colorful terms. But he really doesn't have anything new to say. So we'll skip to chapter 21. Job replies and says to him, the world is not as black and white as you make it. Okay, and this is part of the problem, because they had been going through, chapter after chapter saying, the wicked deserve punishment. You are being punished with this illness, so therefore you are wicked. Black and white, there it is, plain and simple. It's what they're saying to him. But what the truth is that Job replies and says, no, this is not that way all the time, every day in this world. Okay, beginning in verse 7, Job gives evidence that, again, they can look around and see. Who knows, he may have been referring to people that they knew or that were in the area, but for sure somebody who had been around the block, as it were, knew that this was to be true. He says, well then, if the wicked die for their punishments, or they're punished and it's become so egregious because of the wicked nature of the sin that they actually die because that's how bad they are, then why do the wicked live? Verse 7. And become old. Not only is their life not shortened, they lived a long life and they become mighty in power. So not only do they live long, but they gain strength. And then they have family. They have descendants in verse 8. And then they have offspring before their eyes. Their houses are safe. Okay, it's not like they sleep fearfully necessarily at night. Burglars and robbers are not breaking in. He says, and none of them fear God. And the rod of God is not upon them. In other words, the correction that God would mete out on somebody who was sinning. He said their bulls breed without failure. The calves don't have miscarriages. They have flocks. Their children dance. Not only do they have children, they're having a good time. They sing to the tambourine and harp. They rejoice. So again, it's like not only is their life not miserable, it's actually very happy in certain situations and circumstances. And they spend their days in wealth with lots of money. And in a moment, then they go down to the grave. In verse 14, yet they say to God, depart from us, for we do not desire the knowledge of your ways. So they outright reject God. And yet they live these type of lives. So this was Job's rebuttal to them, and it seems like a very strong case, an argument that he makes. And then you go, well, so what do you have to say to that then? So it really breaks down the whole argument. And as we'll see later, and this probably goes hand in hand with this whole, the tenor of it being a case and the defense, and he's making this argument for himself, is that Job was a judge, among other things. And so here he is, he takes their argument and dismantles it and says, look, just because you're wicked doesn't mean that you even go through these type of trials. So then verse 34, then how then can you comfort me with empty words, since falsehood remains in your answers? So the things that you're telling me are not true. Okay, I've already told you that they weren't true, but here's how they don't make sense. Then chapter 22, Eliphaz's third and final assault, as I call it. Verse 5, it says, is not your wickedness great? Okay, this is him speaking to Job. It's like right after Job gets finished saying this, he still wants to stick with the same argument. And your iniquity without end. So Eliphaz is saying that your punishment is so great because your wickedness is so great. Same story, more intensity. Then, verse 17 and 18, he actually contradicts his own reasoning, his own statements by saying, They said to God, depart from us, what can the Almighty do to them? Yet he filled their houses with good things, but the counsel of the wicked is far from me. So he kind of even echoes what Job was saying in the previous chapter. So again, I think he's grasping at straws, and he's a little bit all over the place here. And he's the influence of Job. In fact, what Job's saying, I probably starting to wear on him just a bit. But nonetheless, these arguments are not making any headway. Chapter 23 says, I would present my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would know the words which he would answer me and understand what he would say to me. Would he contend with me in his great power? No. But he would take note of me. There the upright could reason with him, and I would be delivered forever from my judge. So again, you see Job saying, okay, I have a case here to present. And you see this approach that he continues to take. And he's got all the arguments all lined up as far as he thinks. I know the exact words. I know what the answer is. Again, I think that's even one of the rules in law today, is that you never ask a question in court that you don't already know the answer to. So he's saying he would answer me and understand what he would say to me. Would he contend with me in his great power? He goes, no. Again, very presumptuous, very short-sighted, especially in light of what Job already knows and some of the things that he says about God, and that his ways are past knowing and past finding out. And yet for some reason, Job seems to not apply this to himself and his situation. So he just continues on about the same thing. And then verse 24, he continues to answer Eliphaz, where he talks about other innocent people have had the same fate befall them. In other words, punishment for no reason. He says, all the while the wicked get away with their evil ways. So he's saying that, yeah, look, not only do the wicked get away, but sometimes the innocent have things befall them. Verse 12, the dying groan in the city, and the souls of the wounded cry out, yet God does not charge them with wrong. So again, he's saying, okay, here's the punishment, or here's the trials that befall them, but God does not say that they did anything that was sinful. Okay, now, again, we can look through life, through then. You go, okay, is this true? Is it true now? No, okay, nobody's without sin, but again, we're starting to get closer and closer to the heart of the matter here. And he's starting to put all these things together, and he's still coming up with no answers. And then verse 25, he says, now, if it's not so, who will prove me a liar and make my speech worth nothing? So again, he throws it out there and says, is that true or not? Do wicked get away, and are there innocent people who suffer? And again, they don't have necessarily any answer for these things. Then chapter 25, you got Bildad's third and last time to speak. In verse 4, he says, how then can man be righteous before God, or how can he be pure who is born of woman? How much less man who is a maggot, and a son, a man who is a worm. So here he is, he's saying this, and I believe the inference is actually back towards Job. That, okay, Job, not only do you have the maggots on you, okay, they're going to stay there when you go into the grave. They're going to be there with you as you die, and they're going to eat you. Okay, so again, the maggots become you, or you become the maggots, however you want to look at it. But you look at it even in a metaphorical type of way. You're going, okay, man is a maggot, is this little lowly, despicable creature. And so he's going, well, anyway, in the end, we all become fodder for them. But it's also interesting, too, as we go through this, that he says, how then can a man be righteous before God, he says in verse 4. And there's always, there's this truth a lot of times in the things that Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar were saying. It was just in the application. And then there was also other things that they said that perhaps he didn't completely listen to. And again, it becomes difficult because the manner in which they're trying to deliver it. Their attitude was wrong. The accusations many times were false. And so, again, none of this is becoming effective at all. So then, in chapter 26, Job replies, basically, Bildad, you are no help whatsoever. Verse 2 says, how have you helped him who is without power? How have you saved the arm that has no strength? How have you counseled one who has no wisdom? How have you declared sound advice to many? It's like, you didn't do any of those things. He's not even necessarily saying that he is that way per se, granted, but if he were, he still wasn't any help. And then verse 7, again, this is a more interesting part that I resist my own nature to get into, but I have to touch on it anyway because we see this throughout Job, and this is what I find very fascinating too about Job. And I look at these things as being a very strong proof that God exists, that there is a God, is in Job and some of the things that Job says, especially when you consider how long ago this stuff was written. And he goes, and it also shows the inspiration of God. But he goes in verse 7, he says, he stretches out the north over empty space. I'm not even going to address that one, which is also very interesting. But he hangs the earth on nothing. So here it is, verse 7. He's saying God hangs the earth on nothing. So in Greek mythology, how was the earth held up and held in its place? It was Atlas, right? Hence we get the atlas of the world and stuff. But it was supposed to be on his shoulders. All right, this was their best explanation. The Indians, I think it was the Hindus, they believed it was on elephants. There was elephants, right? Because the elephants were the beasts of burden and they were so strong. That it was, I don't know if it was for supernatural elephants or what, but nonetheless, they didn't have any good ideas. But we can all look back at that and you can laugh and see how silly it was. But what was it, maybe 100 years ago that we were even saying, okay, yeah, we're held up by ether, this nebulous type of thing that they've come up with to explain how it is. Well, now we understand that we are suspended by gravity for our best explanation, right, at this point in time. But we understand that it's none of those other things, and that we're just held. We're floating in space on this round dirt ball. It's kind of our spaceship that as we go around the sun. But the point is that the earth literally does not hang on anything. It's not supported in any way. And yet here we have a scripture that there was no way, as far as I know, possible for the people of this time or any time before it or after it to know these things. And yet here it is in verse that, again, if these guys would have written just one incorrect thing, the earth is flat, whatever it is, then they would have said, aha, the whole book is no good because you do not have a perfect all-knowing God who inspired this. So, boom, we're going to throw the whole thing out. Yet this stands. So, again, just emphasize that there are other, and I think I'll touch on a few as we kind of go by them, but there's other ones that show that the earth was round and that it had curvature and so on and so forth, and we'll get to more of those probably in the next message as well. But the point is that this is indeed the inspired word of God. And to a certain degree also he's putting Bildad's astronomical comments from the previous chapter kind of in perspective, because I think he was trying to wax eloquent and throw out this and that, and Job took it a whole nother level, a whole nother step in terms of the knowledge that he had about the way that God was and worked and how he created the universe and how things actually were. Things that, again, like I said, to my knowledge, we have not come to understand until more recently that we could even verify some of these things. That's how, smart we've been for the last 6,000 years. Then chapter 27, he's addressing all three of them again. And he continues in verse 6, as we see in the same vein. He says, "My righteousness I hold fast, and will not let it go." And again, just remember that verse as we come back. I'm trying not to give away the end, which many of us already know. But nonetheless, he talks about that he's going to hold fast to his righteousness here. But he continues, he implies that his friends have been wicked, and that in the way that they've acted against him. And he also again clarifies, in actuality, the wicked do not get away with their misdeeds. So while he was saying before, he said, look, it looks like it. I mean, they're getting away with this, that, and they're doing this and that and the other thing. In actuality, God does punish them. Now, he was also implying to them that you're in danger of the same exact thing happening to you if you continue in your wicked ways. Chapter 28, Job, to me, says the key scripture is Job 28, verse 12. He says, "But where can wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding?" So again, he's asking these questions. And again, he doesn't have the answer to everything. But he does put it in perspective in verses 18 and 19. He says, "The price of wisdom is above rubies," above the value of the topaz of Ethiopia. And it can't even be valued in comparison to pure gold. And again, I know that these things always seem difficult to understand and grasp and believe when it comes to God and the wisdom that he imparts through the words of this Bible, which, I think most people can get a Bible for free these days. It's not that they are hard to come by. I know I've downloaded, many of them off the internet. So it's not like this is difficult. Yet, the words that are contained in it, when you study it and you put it all together, are by far more valuable than anything that you're ever going to come across. And he's trying to make this point here. But this is a word for the young ones, as well as the older ones who are still coming to grips with these things, that money is not the answer. Money is not the end-all, be-all. That is, there are things that are much more important. And this is part 2 of the lesson that God is trying to teach Job. He had to strip him of everything to kind of get his attention, as it were. Then verse 21, back to more of the science stuff. It says, "Hidden from all the eyes of all the living, and concealed from the birds of the air." Again, certain scientific insights man is never going to know or come to grips with. They're still trying to figure out many things. And some of it, like I said, has only been discovered in the last century. But verse 25, it goes, to establish a weight for the wind, and apportion the waters by measure. And he made a law for the rain and a path for the thunderbolt. Again, these things, they're now starting to understand in terms of how the wind and the rain and all these things move and act, and even thunder and lightning and whatnot. And whenever you understand exactly how it is, you go back to Job and you say, oh, okay, so there was some understanding back then that was beyond man. Then verse 28, he said to the man, and to the man he said, "Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding." So he's saying this is the only true place that wisdom can come from, can come from God. And Proverbs 1:7 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." Very similar verses. Two things. One is that it's small Lord here and a big Lord in Proverbs 1:7. So it's Adonai and Jehovah. But again, it says the fear of either one of them, in this respect, is the beginning of wisdom. Now, what we do know is that there were two Jehovahs as well, and we talked about that recently as well. So again, he's talking about, though, the fact, the other second point here, is that this is where wisdom and understanding come from? What was it that Job lacked here? Not the real thing, not the issue, his specific issue, his character flaw. It was he lacked understanding, right, as to what this was. So what is the answer to it? It's the fear of the Lord. And I think this is one of the keys to why Job did not understand what was happening to him, what was going on, because when you look at the things that Job was saying, to me it lacked fear in the real sense of the word, but in the sense that it's meant here in the Bible, fear means respect, more or less. And he said, he didn't have this respect of God either, and those two kind of go hand in hand. So here it is. Why is it that Job is not understanding what he's going through? Well, because he did not have that fear of the Lord, which is interesting because he's the one saying these things. So he's saying a lot of stuff, but he's just not applying it fully. So we'll talk about, again, what was happening to him a little bit more later. Now, finally, chapter 29 through 31, Job is kind of making his summarizing statement, his summary statement of his defense for the case that he's been making all along. And this is chapters 29 through 31. So in verse 2, he said, "Oh, that I were as in months past," the way it used to be, "as in the days when God watched over me." Okay, what's wrong with that statement? He's saying, I wish now God would watch over me. So what he didn't realize was that God was still with him, not only this time, but through the entire trial. God is the one who precipitated the trial to try to bring him to the understanding, and he's watching very carefully over it. He gave Satan in the beginning only so much rein, or so much rope, as it were, to do the things that he did to Satan. God watched over that in that sense and said, okay, you can only go so far. So we know that God was watching over him, and God always watches over his children and continues to watch over them. And what we see here is that Job does not have that understanding in this, that he continues to miss the point here in what is going. And look, I'm not going to be too harsh on Job. I don't want to fall into the same category as his three friends either. But he, right here, seems to be lacking some understanding. But I'm going to cut him a little slack because of all that he was going through, having lost his kids, his animals, his property. Now he's afflicted with this disease that we'll see a little bit more about here in just a little bit. But he was going through a great deal of pain, and he had these great comforters with him, and so his situation was very, very bad all the way through. And so for that reason, it's like we won't judge him too harshly on some of these things. But nonetheless, these things are written for our example, so that there are lessons that we can learn from it. Now, he's looking longingly in this chapter, he's looking longingly back at what he had. He had God, as we just saw. He had family, he had prosperity, he had the respect of the community. In verses 9 and 10, it shows that he had the ear of the princes and nobles. When he spoke, man, they put their hand over their mouth, they listened to what he had to say. And he sat as chief and dwelt as a king in the army, which it says in some of the later verses there. And then in verses 14 through 17, it shows that he was in a position to judge righteously and to help the needy and to help those that were being afflicted by the wicked. So we see that Job, had a position within this area, this land, this community, however you want to look at it, and he was very well respected. And again, when you read through this, and it's a good idea to look at it and to see the things that he did, all right, in terms of helping the poor and aiding it, and in other words, just being a Christian in many respects, but just being a godly man that was able to do a lot of good. And then verse 22, it says, "After my words they did not speak, and my speech settled them as dew. So this is the way that it used to be, right? Everybody used to, when he spoke, that was it. Everybody listened and did and said, okay, this is the way it is. But it's obviously not the way that Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar were. Right? They continued to speak every time after Job continued to speak. And so to a certain degree, he was lamenting that, and he was lamenting his former state, the way he was. Now, one other interesting thing that I can point out about Job 29 here, and I didn't go, it probably been nice to go do this with a whole bunch of the other chapters, but Job says I, me, or my, at least, well, approximately 50 times. It depends on the version of the Bible that you're reading. But here we are, and how many verses are there? 25 verses in the chapter, 24, 25? He goes, and he says it 50 times. I. Me, my. Now, it wasn't always bad, but it was always in reference to him and what he did and what he was doing and how basically upright and blameless he was. Right? So, again, put that in your memory storage for later too. We'll come back to that. So then chapter 30, he then flips it over. And he says, okay, that's what he had, but now look at everything's the exact opposite. And he almost goes through it and answers everything that he said in chapter 29 and says, look, it's bad. Everything that I had before, it's all gone. All those things are gone. Young men would get up when I come, and now what do? They have no respect for him. In verse 10, they abhor me, they keep far from me. They do not hesitate to spit in my face. Now, I'm not sure if that's literal or metaphorical, but I think it was literal. Because here he is on the side of the road looking like an indigent. And, again, when we look at verse 18, he describes his disease a little more. He says, by great force, my garment is disfigured. It binds me about as the collar of my coat. What does that mean? I mean, think of the thing that they used to be loose-fitting things from everything I understand that they wore. But now all of a sudden, by great force, his garment is disfigured. Okay, and I think that could be just the color of it has now changed because of the boils, right? But it's also fitting him very tightly, like the collar of the coat. It's like, I don't even want to get into it or try to imagine it too much. But in verse 30, he goes, my skin grows black and falls from me. My bones burn with fever. So he describes it. And so imagine this individual, as you will, sitting on the side of the road. And there were others around him and watching, but again, people looked down upon him. And maybe they presumed and assumed the same things that his three friends were. So then chapter 30 ends pretty much the same fashion that chapter 29 began. He says, I cry out to you, but you do not answer me. I stand up and you regard me, but you have become cruel to me. With the strength of your hand you oppose me. Okay, this is God the Father, our loving, caring, merciful, kind, compassionate, long-suffering, enduring Father who wants to treat us as a child. And the New Testament talks about how a father, he says, if a father's not going to give you a rock for bread or a scorpion, how much more then will your Father in heaven take care of you? And we see, he talks about the lilies of the field and the sparrows. So of course God's going to take care of you. God is perfect. God is love. And so again, God is not cruel. Now, is he going to make sure that we understand, that we grow, and that we see the things that we need to change? Yeah. Is that painful? Well, yeah, it can be, but it's brought on. We bring it on ourselves, these things. God wants to help you, not because he wants to let you endure this temporary physical suffering and pain and existence so that you can be with him forever, eternally. Okay, and that's not cruel. It's like, let's just do what's necessary. Let's make you this gold that's refined by fire, that's pure, so that you can be a part of the kingdom, which is so much greater. So again, we see Job does not have this right perspective on things. And then 31, Job goes through the chapter showing how righteous he's been, and he shows that he understood even the spirit of the law. So here we are seeing this in again, something that Christ brings in the Beatitudes, like in Matthew 5 to verse 7, in terms of saying, okay, well, I'm telling you don't kill, but I'm also telling you don't even hate. And so as you read through that chapter, kind of keep an eye open for that as you go through it. Then, verse 35, he says, "Oh, that I had one to hear me," speaking of God. "Here is my mark." So it's his signature. He basically signs off on everything that he's been saying. "Oh, that the Almighty would answer me, that my prosecutor had written a book. Surely I would carry it on my shoulder and bind it on me with a crown. I would declare to him the number of steps like a prince. I would approach him." He's saying that, if there was any more to do, I would have done those things. He says, in all of this, God was not being just in his treatment, and that Job did not deserve all of this. So even with his own talk regarding the ways of God, it does not seem that Job appropriately applied it to himself. And this is really the height of hubris. And then verse 40, we see the words of Job are ended. So now, after 31 chapters of toing and froing, Job rests his case. So now we're at chapter 32. Elihu. That's like a question mark. Elihu? Elihu. Okay, no, he's not even been mentioned till this part, right? So we're going to take a little more time to go through chapter 32 and go a little more in depth, because now we're coming to the heart of the matter. And Elihu gets to it very quickly, in fact. So verse 1, he says, well, not him, but it says, "So these three men ceased answering Job because he was righteous in his own eyes." Now, interestingly enough, he was righteous, and he was telling them, and they felt he was only righteous in his own eyes. But this was also part of the problem. Remember what we were talking about in chapter 29, that he's I, me, my about 50 times? He was telling us how righteous he was. Right? Now verse 2. "Then the wrath of Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite of the family of Ram." So he has to establish who he is, because these other men, if you remember, we talked about, could have been kings and governors in the area. But who is this guy? He's had to wait 31 chapters to talk, right? So it gives kind of credence to that the other three guys were something important, but he is less renowned and he needs more of an introduction. And he says that he was aroused against Job. Right? And his wrath was aroused because he justified himself rather than God. Again, this is probably the key to the chapter. That's the chapter, the book. Is that here was Job's problem. Job was blaming God. This is what he's saying here. He's blaming God instead of himself. Job was justifying himself. And what is justification? It is to be made right. Job was making himself right. Okay, by doing all these things that who told him to do? That he wouldn't have known without it? Justification can only come from God. Right? We went through all this in Galatians. Basically, the whole story of Galatians, right, is about justification. But in Romans 3:20 it says, and again I'll just quote it for you, it says, "Therefore by the deeds of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight." So what was it that Job was saying? He was saying he was righteous because he did all these things. Because remember chapter 29, he goes through, and you go back and read it, he's talking about, and he did do those things, but it wasn't what made Job righteous. The problem that Job had was that he thought that he was solely responsible for his own righteousness, that he was righteous because of himself. This is known as self-righteous. All right. Now, self-righteous today means, I think, he's self-righteous. It kind of means that somebody who always thinks that they're right. Okay, well, that's what it has come to mean and the way people use it. Technically speaking, is if you believe that you can make yourself righteous, you are self-righteous. What we learn through Galatians is that righteousness only comes from God. It's a gift from God, and that justification can only be made through that mechanism. Okay, it's not by anything that we do. And so, again, what it says here in verse 20 of Romans 3 is that it's not by the deeds of the law. And this is what Job was doing. This is what Job was thinking, that he was very righteous in and of himself. And so to be self-righteous is to disregard what righteousness truly is and where it truly comes from. So throughout the book of Job, to this point, Job continued to stand on his own righteousness. He seemed to do it all the more when his friends falsely accused him of sinning. He kept saying, no, I am righteous. I did these things. Then continuing in verse 3, it says, also against his 3 friends his wrath was aroused, because they had found no answer and yet had condemned Job. So now we have another confirmation that these 3 guys, and this is kind of why we sped through this whole thing, is because they weren't doing what was right. They were not approaching this in the right way, and it was, time and time again. So God said in chapter 42 and verse 7 that we read before, that these guys were not doing what's right. And then here we have Elihu, who's also saying that they were off base. So Elihu sat there and listened to their diatribes. He saw how they were condemning him for things that he was not doing, and they failed to actually get to the heart of the matter and see what was truly wrong. And verse 4, now because they were years older than he, these guys, out of respect, Elihu had waited to speak to Job, and this showed that, again, a certain thing, I say this because Elihu is sometimes thought to be arrogant and self-important and all these things, but I think he shows a certain amount of humility, and as we go on, we see that God is indeed using him. But again, he sat there this whole time out of respect for these other more knowledgeable, more powerful men, and listened to what they had to say, up until the point when he had to speak, as it were. So when Elihu saw, verse 5, that there was no answer in the mouth of these men, his wrath was aroused. So after they pontificated about everything, they never got to the heart of the matter. Now, Elihu said, I am young in years, and you are very old. Therefore I was afraid to speak, and dared not declare to you my opinion. I said, age should speak. Multitude of years should teach wisdom. This is what these guys were supposed to be doing, and he gave them that chance. But he goes on in verse 8, he says, there is a spirit in man. Okay? Again, this is one of the scriptures I memorized from when I was younger, but it shows that there's a spirit in man. Man has a spirit. And again, while this might seem like a simple concept to all of us, many people don't realize this, but 1 Corinthians 2 also talks about it as well. But the other interesting thing here is that, okay, the spirit of man, which is different from the Holy Spirit, looks like it interacts with God's Spirit. This is the way God's Spirit works with us. In verse 8 it says, there's a spirit in man, and the breath of the Almighty gives him understanding. So this is the same breath that he creates with. It's also translated spirit in other places. But this spirit in man that we have is what separates us from the animal kingdom. Okay, it puts us on a completely different plane. And even though there's all these similarities between us and whatever it is, apes or dolphins and things like this, these higher order primates, the spirit in man is what completely differentiates us. Now we see, though, that Elihu is saying, okay, God inspires man, okay, and it looks like he uses the spirit of man to communicate to man so that he can inspire him, these God-breathed words, and what it is that Elihu is going to further say. And this is, I think, a setup for why he is saying what he's saying. And you put 1 Corinthians 12:8 in your notes as well. It says, For to one is given the word of wisdom through Spirit. Okay, so it comes through God's Spirit, it is saying. So when you put all these things together with 1 Corinthians 2 and whatnot, it does seem that this is the way that God communicates with man. And he says in verse 9, following on, let's keep this in mind, that God, this is the way God works with his Spirit through to our spirit. He says, great men are not always wise, nor do the aged always understand. So it's kind of a, if not a direct shot, a shot across the bow for sure, of these three men who were great men and aged men. But he's saying that God's inspiration through his Spirit can usurp the understanding and wisdom that comes with these men because of their age and ability. So I think he's kind of setting it up to say, again, what he's about to say. Verse 12, he says, I paid close attention to you, and surely not one of you convinced Job or answered his words. So this whole time he's sitting there, he's telling Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar that in all their knowledge and wisdom and understanding, they never really answered Job's concerns. Okay, and the things that Job said, they never directly answered. And of course, this could account for a lot of Job's frustration in his replies. But then he tells them in verse 18, for I am full of words, the Spirit within me compels me. All right, so when we look at this as in the context, Elihu is saying that he is being inspired by God to deliver what he's going to deliver over the next several chapters. All the things he's going to say. And what we do see in the end, in the very end, is that God condemned what the three said, but never what Elihu said. And so in this respect, we see that what Elihu ends up saying is indeed inspired words, and of course inspired by God, to tell Job the things that Job needs to hear. Then continuing on verse 19 and 20, he says, indeed my belly is like wine, it has no vent, it's ready to burst like new wineskins. I will speak that I may find relief, I must open my lips and answer. So if you didn't know it already, Elihu, after 31 chapters, is chomping at the bit to say his piece. And he lets them know now that he is going to say it. And he says, also, here's how I'm going to tell you. He says, verse 21 and 22, let me not, I pray, show partiality to anyone. All right, and I think he had to say this to a certain degree to kind of preface his words, because he was the younger one here, and these were all aged men, great men, men of respect in the community. But he's going to say, look, I am not going to flatter you. He says, nor let me flatter any man, for I do not know how to flatter. Else my Maker would soon take me away. So it'll be direct, and it's going to be without regard to anybody's position, is what he has to say. So we're going to leave it there, and we'll get back to the heart of the matter next time in the book of Job.